Hey, Fiends of the Pod, this is your host, Nate Wyckoff, and I want to remind you, go ahead and like and subscribe and check out cultandclassicfilms.com, where you can get cult movies exclusive to us with all sorts of extras like Pogs. We're supposed to call them milk caps. They're not Pogs. I don't know what Pogs are. Autographed posters, slipcovers, all sorts of neat things. You can also subscribe to have them delivered to your door every month at a discount. That is cultandclassicfilms.com. Remember, like, subscribe, comment, and refer to your friends, even your enemies. Every time you like and subscribe, we make sure Michael Cera makes another film. Yeah, that's right. It's us. Enjoy.
Welcome to Cult and Classic.
Raving with my 5-year-olds.
Yeah,
Tonight.
yeah. You were at like
So, yeah.
a smoke bubble
Woo.
Halloween rave.
Oh yeah, like you do, you know.
just a normal Massachusetts evening.
My neighborhood is pretty awesome. Actually, there's just this house that just does a thing for a couple weeks, like every night, and they had smoke bubbles today. I'd never even seen a smoke bubble machine before. Mind blown.
So like when you
Like,
pop it, like smoke comes out, right? Because it
yes.
hasn't.
Yeah.
That's
So
wild.
like the bubbles are like super opaque. So if it's like at night and there's a light show, like they really, really show up in the dark versus like clear bubbles that you can't really see
Weird.
that much.
Yeah.
And there's fog that comes out around them. So like they really, really show up. And then when you pop the bubbles, there's like a little smoke explosion because there was smoke encapsulated inside the bubble.
That's so cool. Like that would be great for like a spaceship scene or something in a low budget
Yes.
flick, as
It was
we
very cool.
love.
I think, yeah, yeah. So you like pop them with your your fingertip is kind of the best way to pop them for the visual because then it was just like poof, like magic.
That's
Big
cool. Yeah.
smoke. Yeah.
One of my cats
So
would think of
it's fine.
that.
So it was definitely, I mean, for me, worth staying up later to do podcast.
Yeah, yeah. We're starting a little bit late, but not too bad. And I'm of course your host, film critic, and comedian Nate Wyckoff. I'm really excited. This is our um double feature. This is part one, but it's the Priests in Peril double feature. And Mandy, specifically, you've been asking for us part two, and so I paired it with part one. We're going to be talking about today 1977's Exorcist II: The Heretic. It is the sequel to Exorcist from 1977. There is so much production history and tidbits about this movie. Um very, very excited to talk about it. So this is I'm a big fan of The Exorcist, and as our very first podcast episode here was talking about, our very first movie was talking about Exorcist 3, aka Legion, which was written and directed from his book by William Peter Blatty, who of course wrote the original Exorcist book and the screenplay for the famed original film. He hated this movie so much that he basically like muscled his way apparently to get um the third one made, which didn't get made until I think 1980, like 13 years after this film. So Exorcist 2 was
Wow.
considered like
Because
a
we all know making a
franchise.
third film like erases the previous film.
Yeah, not, I mean, this was sort of an early version of that. Now we do that all the time, especially with comic movies being so popular, they'll retcon a movie like with the snap of a finger with the next movie. It doesn't really phase them.
How many Spider-Mans are we on now? Like
I know, like this is the
2000? I don't
this
even
is the
know.
third, unless you count the live action TV series and their TV movies. It's just yeah. So The Exorcist 3, you can go back and listen. It's our very first episode. We paired it with Donald Farmer's Shark Exorcist, and spoiler alert, Shark Exorcist 2 is coming out soon, and we will definitely be talking about it. Jeff, who hasn't been on for a while but is still active member of the Cult and Classic Films pod, is gonna come back for Shark Exorcist 2. He actually watched the first one like I think several times because he was so trying to figure it out, which I think might be it might not be possible, but I'm glad he gave the effort to it. So we've paired this movie with next week's feature, Velocipaster from 2018, which is probably, I mean, it's one of the more famous low budget cult goofball movies to come out in like, in the 2010s, I think, because it got picked up for streaming by Amazon Prime, and it's the premise is so goofy. A pastor who becomes basically a velociraptor werewolf, a were velociraptor, and tries to fight crime with it. It's wild, and there's ninjas.
So
Anyway,
great.
we'll talk about it next week. It's an
There
exciting
don't
one.
seem to be very many rules. His whole body doesn't have
No,
to change. Like
no, and I mean,
it's amazing.
there's a lot to talk about. I mean, you know, we've I mean, hey, we release low budget films now here at Colton Classic. You can check them out at coltonclassicfilms.com or subscribe to get them monthly at patreon.com/Colton Classic Films. So cheap, only $20, $25 for a collector's edition every month. Anyway, back to this. Yeah, Velocipaster. We're going to talk about it. There's a lot to talk about. It's going to be fun. There is even, believe it or not, even more from the production side to talk about this week with Exorcist II. So the plot, you know, anybody that's seen The Exorcist, and I think that's most people around today, have seen The Exorcist, the original film, and it launched Linda Blair's career. I mean, she's been acting since I think she was like 5 years old. She was a child, and you know, still she appears in some things, and she's done just a huge amount of movies and is sort of an icon, especially for those of us into cult and genre films. I mean, everything from horror to action to women in prison films. You know, she's done them all, and she was even a guest judge on RuPaul's Drag Race. So she's done everything. She's fantastic. We actually talked about one of her movies with our back when we talked about what was it called? I forget what it's even called, but it was with David Hasselhoff and her. There were two names. Something in the Bean was one of the versions. Anyway, great film. You can go check it out. Dig through our past catalog. You'll find all sorts of fun stuff. But we've talked about Linda Blair before. She's great. So The Exorcist involves a young Linda Blair being possessed by the demon, which is called Pazuzu. I don't even know that Pazuzu is actually mentioned in the original theater cut of The Exorcist as the name, but regardless, in later incarnations, that is the name given. It was a fantastic film, creeped people out. There were all sorts of stories still circulating about how it was a cursed film. Prince caught fire. People were injured. Theaters wouldn't show it. People were screaming the Catholic Church denouncing it. All sorts of crazy things, because it is a very Catholic-based faith film, and it sort of ends with the seeming death of Catholic priests trying to exorcise Linda Blair's character. And it's truly, if you've never seen it, you really should see it as a fan of cinema, not just horror cinema, but cinema in general, because you kind of need it as a reference for so many things today. And the horror films that come out in theaters today, and I'm not speaking of everything, A24 and some others do some very interesting, edgy things. I mean, edgy is kind of a dirty word now, right? We think of edgelord, we think of just dark hot topic for the sake of hot topic kind of vibe. But it's this one's called The Heretic, but The Exorcist is very heretical. It is really intense, especially for those who are consider themselves devout Catholics. It's a bit terrifying. So The Exorcist scared people, huge hubbub, incredibly successful film. And then The Exorcist II comes out a few years later, I think, 3 years later or something. Anyway, comes out later in 1977, and it is apparently laughed at in the premiere and early screenings, with people in Los Angeles throwing things at the screen. There's a story that apparently a Warner Brothers executive told to, I think, the first film's director, William Friedkin, about the movie getting partway in, and we'll talk about where, and it becoming so ridiculous to the audiences who love The Exorcist that they got up, and one was like, the people who made it are here, and they chased the producers out onto the street. So it's really like, this was a big deal. There were essentially riots to some extent. Yeah. So because of this film, it's considered one of the worst sequels of all time. We'll talk about whether it deserves that or not. I personally had only watched it once before, which is saying something, because I was incredibly disappointed in it, because I didn't know this is years ago when I first watched it. I loved The Exorcist so much when I was like, oh, there's a sequel, and I knew about Legion, the third sequel, because I'd read the book. This one I was like, oh, so excited, watched it, and I was like, oh, this is why I haven't heard of it. There's some problems. This is real rough. So, and now of course, as you're listening to this and as we're recording it, The Exorcist Believers is in theaters right now, which has given me a new insight into Exorcist II. I will say that. So anyway, the plot of Exorcist II is that Linda Blair's character is a few years older. She's still a young woman, and a priest is sent to talk to her because the elderly priest who died trying to exorcise her from the first film is being defamed in the church. And I think the cardinal of this region sends this particular priest, who is a friend of the dead man's, to go and sort of find out the details, prove it was a legitimate possession, and find evidence, and that way sort of clear the dead priest's name, get people to stop saying essentially he was a fake or whatever. And that, okay, right? I mean, it's not what I would do for the sequel, but you could work with something like that, right? You have Linda Blair, you have a priest going to determine if something's actually, demonic, etc. On board enough. And then it goes off the rails because Linda Blair is working with a therapist at some sort of weird Montessori children with disabilities ward. I don't
Carnival ride
Carnival
mirror.
ride. It's really bizarre. There's just basically, and I'm not being flippant about this. They basically just took several children with disabilities, several, especially children with Down syndrome, and just put them in the background doing games, carnival games, just wandering around, weird things.
Yeah. I
Very
was just
weird.
thinking like Hall of Mirrors, like her
Yeah,
office is
totally.
like
It's
Hall of Mirrors carnival-esque
I forget
weirdness.
what the French prison is called, where it's like there's a center column and all the cells radiate from that center column, and they have tiny holes from the center that can peer into the cells. And the idea is that very few guards can see everyone, and the prisoners never know when they're being watched. So it
Oh
sort of breeds
wow.
this terror. And it is a really fascinating thing. But that's sort of like what this was, right? The offices are in these round glass chambers throughout the room, so you can in theory see a bunch of everyone around, but it makes no sense. And also it's irrelevant to the plot. So there you go.
Right.
Which is so
And
indicative of
also
how this.
so unsettling because they don't really like show you that that's what their offices are like. Because she goes in
No.
for like a therapy session, like in a
Who has
fishbowl.
a therapy session in wherever? Why don't you just
Like,
have them in a phone booth on the street,
like
like
where you
just
can see it, even if it's like, and then you realize, oh, people can't see it, and it's like kind of like one way glass from
I
the
I
outside,
don't
and
know.
then,
I
but
it's
like you don't do that. You don't want to be like surrounded in a crowd. Like that doesn't work.
it's
For,
real
it was
terrible.
just so unsettling. I was so uncomfortable.
Yes. And also it's
Like,
distracting for, like, especially because
yeah,
it's not, like you said, it's not referenced.
yeah.
So it makes no sense. Anyway, so Regan is being treated by this doctor, played by Louise Fletcher, who is, these are this cast is incredible. Frankly, it is an incredible cast. We will go into it, but Louise Fletcher plays Dr. Tuskin, who is her sort of psychotherapist, and basically Linda's been having nightmares, sort of reliving events from the possession. Which, hey, I can understand that. The
Mm,
doctor Linda's trying to convince the doctor that everything's fine and the dreams are gone, but of course they're not. Uh,
mm.
this is where people lost their mind, and where I also lost my mind when I first watched this film. They quickly introduce a thing called the synthesizer, which, by the way, there are already things called synthesizers. They're musical instruments. And it connects people's brains so you can enter someone else's dreams, a la Dreamscape with Dennis Quaid.
Mhm.
This is like part of the thing about The Exorcist is it took place in the real world. They built it into a supernatural presence invading what we think of as reality, and that's terrifying. The fact that they created this goofball science toy um completely throws that out the window, right? All of a sudden you're expected to believe something so outlandish that even in the late 70s everybody's like, this doesn't exist, this isn't even close to existing, and it doesn't even make any sense. Dreams aren't like that. Like, it just didn't make any sense. But they totally they handled it in the most ham-fisted way possible. Literally, you go into someone's dream, and of course, basically the demon is somehow residing in Linda Blair's Regan's head, kind
Oh,
of, and can affect
and
people who are
it
in the
wasn't
dreams.
even good like that J-Lo movie was
Oh,
quote unquote good. She's like the dream therapist, like very
The
similarly,
cell,
like
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
people who are like, having severe issues, like she goes into their dreamscapes with them and like helps them out. But yeah,
yeah,
like
and I mean,
not
aside from the
not quote unquote good like that movie was.
right, and I mean, I wasn't even a huge fan of the cell. It's visually stunning, but the thing
Yeah, it
is
is
they
very
delivered
much.
that device for the plot
Mhm.
immediately. And so
Yes.
you understood, oh, this is what I need to buy into to watch this film. It'd be
Mm-hmm.
like the way they did this with the sequel is sort of like if we had if you took Saving Private Ryan and you made a sequel where they brought Ryan back in an android body in 1960. Like
Okay.
you'd be like, wait a minute, the fuck? Like what am I
Hmm.
supposed to how am I supposed to even connect this? Like it doesn't check
Yeah.
out. So that's where a lot of people lost their mind, understandably, in my opinion.
Hmm.
And the plot, this movie is narratively a huge mess. It's very difficult to separate all of the different components. They tried to cram all
Hmm.
sorts of things. So we have Linda Blair having visions of not just her demon possessed self,
Hmm.
but an African village where there's a demonic swarm of locusts, and a young boy has sort of healing powers and is considered kind of for lack of for white person term shamanic. I know that's not a white term, but we now use that in white culture for everything that isn't Judeo-Christian. And so not to be flippant, but I'm apparently being really flippant this episode. But it's hard not to with this movie because they're heavy-handed and they don't know what they're doing.
Hmm.
So anyway, she sees that, and it then turns out to be James Earl Jones, who was possessed and then apparently exorcised, not by Father Marin, who is played by Max von Sydow in the original film and returns very briefly here. But anyway, through a long series of events, the new priest, who is played by none other than former Elizabeth Taylor husband Richard Burton. I mean, this is we're not kidding with this cast. Linda Blair, Richard Burton, Louise Fletcher, Max von Sydow, Paul Henreid. I mean, of course, James Earl Jones, Ned Beatty is in this. It is bonkers who they got for this film. And everyone is wasted. Every single person.
Yeah.
Because
Every
the
single
plot
one.
is insane. So anyway, the priest Richard Burton goes, he seems to not really believe. He seems to be having a sort of a crisis of faith, which again is a retread of the much better crisis of faith in the original Exorcist.
Mm.
And it just you're kind of rehashing things while cramming a bunch of other elements in. And they end up Pazuzu ends up being still tormenting Linda Blair. She almost steps off her balcony skyrise building, which apparently was a real skyrise and there are no supports, and she actually was standing on the edge. I don't know if that's true. It seems a little sketchy to me, but hey, it was a sketchy production, so it's possible. And they end up going, the Richard Burton's character ends up going to find this boy from Linda Blair's dream visions, who's now a man, James Earl Jones, and he goes to find him because he fought Pazuzu. So he survived Pazuzu, an exorcism, so he wants to know how. Ironically, Linda Blair also survived an exorcism by Pazuzu, so it's kind of confusing why this is why. Um, the little trick that they try and do, and they don't really hit it well enough to be super clear, I think, especially if you're a first-time viewer, is that Pazuzu is the one Richard Burton is talking to in these visions that Linda Blair seems to impart to him, I guess. He's the one that is taking on the wings of a locust uh, Richard Burton to these locations to help him find James Earl Jones' character. And the implication then is that Pazuzu is actually like Richard Burton's character of the priest is actually entering into a relationship, of course, very anti-Christian relationship with the evil Pazuzu by accepting his help to do this. Now that I find an interesting concept, right? Because it's a different way to entice a theoretically pure good person to uh, to be evil, right? You're helping them do something kind for someone else, i.e., helping him find help for Linda Blair. That is, though, it's so poorly done and touched on that, like everything else, even the things that are, if you're watching the video of this, my hair is straight up out of control. I have to get, it looks like I'm wearing a bad toupee and it is in my face. But if you're listening, sorry. So it's just a mess. I mean, it's a real mess. And we have snippets, I think, of actual potential brilliance visually, especially there's some cool effects, but we have a lot of half-hearted both acting, I think, especially on Richard Burton's part as the priest, and we have a lot of threads that are never tied, and then we have an ending that just it's real. I anyway,
It's something.
Mandy, right?
It's
Yeah,
real
nothing.
something.
Yeah, it's nothing yet something. Mandy, what were you expecting going into this film, and what did you come away thinking about The Exorcist II, which they wanted to call The Heretic by itself, but the studio said no, people need to understand this is related to the
Yeah,
franchise.
we need to actually tell them this is an Exorcist film, or they will not know. Like, no one's going to pick that up. Oh man, honestly, I will admit, like, I cannot recall actually ever seeing the original Exorcist. I've seen
Blasphemy. I'm
many.
just kidding.
I know, right? Like, I've seen many of the other like sequels
Mhm.
that were released more in the time that we would have been going to
Exorcist the
theaters from like
beginning, yeah.
90s or whatever. So like I remember a bunch. I think I owned a few like copies of like DVDs of a couple of the later
And there was
ones.
Dominion, yeah, the
Yeah.
prequel to The Exorcist,
Yeah.
yes.
So yeah, I guess I was expecting more of like what the later ones were like. We're like, oh, good horror film, possessed
Yeah.
person, like
More
shenanigans,
religious
haunting.
context is what one of the things I was
Probably, yeah,
expecting,
more
yeah.
like context. And then what we got was this hot mess that you described. Just absolute weirdness. Like I was uncomfortable with how the people with differently abledness or
Yeah.
like different kind of brains were like presented in this film.
They're just used as
Uh,
colorful background flavor.
like so there's that one scene with the girl who they labeled as autistic who was nonverbal, and then
Spoke
he
because
spoke, and like the mom goes like kind of bonkers, which I can totally understand if had like an 8 or 9 year old child who never spoken before and suddenly started to speak.
right.
I might lose it a bit. But it was just like, it was just like I was like, why show this main character's ability to heal? Because that was also a minor plot point that
Yeah, that never comes
wasn't
to
like
anything.
really built up as much as it should have been, because
Yeah.
it ended up being like a pretty key part of the plot or like driver of the plot, and yet I felt like they just buried the lead, kind of like,
Yeah.
oh, she's so good, that's why she's being possessed, like he's because he's just trying to take out the good ones, sort.
Yeah,
So that's why they're picked, and like they just totally kind of buried the lead, and then like used the example as her helping someone who's labeled autistic and nonverbal, like to just speak, and how important that was to their caregivers and people around them. I was like, I don't know. I was like, that didn't age well, in my opinion.
no, it's sort of like, I mean, it seems a little exploitative, which is funny because
Yeah.
so John Boorman directed this
Mm,
movie and also credited himself as a co-writer because he changed the script a lot, which I'll talk about in a minute.
yeah.
But John Boorman, Sir John Boorman, he was actually knighted, I believe, is, I mean, he's made some famous films, and he's also himself, I believe he always self-identified as a Catholic. He went to Catholic school, anyway. But he produced a lot of pretty big films. I mean, he did The Tailor of Panama in 2001. He was working until very recently. I think most people listening to this podcast will probably remember him more from Excalibur from 81, or Zardoz from 74, or most likely as the director of Deliverance from 1972, the backwoods banjo playing rapists film. What's crazy about this to me, and I can only imagine it stems from his religious background, which William Peter Blatty has very much so, and that is why he deals with the themes of Christianity and Judaism so heavily in his books and films. I can only imagine that flavored John Boorman's view of the first Exorcist film, because he said he hated it. He did not like it. He actually was asked, I believe, before William Friedkin, who directed the first one, to direct it, and he said no because he thought the script was, I mean, he used terms like disgusting and I think vile. Uh,
Yeah.
he thought it was exploitative, particularly of the child actor who turned out to be Linda Blair. That was also the view of several other critics. But I'm like, you think that this film is too much, yet you've made Deliverance, and and you also made Zardoz instead of the first Exorcist film, which features if no one's ever seen that, please go check it out. Its biggest claim to fame is featuring Sean Connery in a red bondage leather vest thong for the entire film. Uh, it is bonkers banana sandwich. Charlotte Rampling is his is his co-star in that. But anyway, so it really strikes me as funny that that is sort of was his takeaway from The Exorcist. So what he wanted to do with this, according to him, is he wanted to make a film where there was hope, right? Where it was actually sort of the antithesis to the first Exorcist film, because the first Exorcist film, Linda Blair is freed of possession. However, it
Mhm.
cost the lives of theoretically of several people, right? We find out
Mhm.
in Legion that one person, um, I guess it did cost their lives essentially. But anyway, it has a bleak ending. Um, for many. But I would argue it's not completely bleak, right? It's a sacrifice thing, and Christianity is all about sacrifice. So, well, if you
Mhm.
read the book as opposed to listening to pundits and evangelical
I say
preachers,
by definition,
yeah,
it's about
okay.
sacrifice, right? You know?
Read things,
Yeah.
listen to audiobooks. Let's educate ourselves here. So that was his view. And this film, and so you can see some of that kind of shoehorned in here with like, she's a healer and she's one of the really good ones. And that's why Pazuzu's trying to get rid of her, much like he tried to get rid of James Earl Jones' character in Africa because he was a healer. He had a
Yeah.
special, presumably God-given power. What
Mm.
is stupid about that, in my opinion, as a viewer, and I think what a lot of people, even if they didn't put into words, hated about that concept and that part of the movie, in addition to things like the synthesizer dream machine, is
Mm.
that it it's like it's like in Star Wars Episode 1 where George Lucas tried to explain the Force as tiny
Mm.
creatures living in the bloodstream, right? The midichlorians.
Mhm.
A lot of people hated that because it removed the mysticism from it and it made it
Sure.
science. I know why he was doing it, right? He wanted to bring science and religion together, right? He wanted
Mhm.
to bring to say basically, look, you can combine faith of some kind, like faith in the
Mhm.
force and this connection between all things, with a physical, recordable thing. And it's a beautiful idea, but you can't do it in a nuanced way, right? That
Like
would
the
take
quantitative metrics are not nuanced.
exactly like, and you couldn't get there like unless there was a several thousand page reading of philosophy to get there. It's not going to happen. It just
Mhm.
feels, you know, clumsy. And
Yeah.
and that's sort of the vibe that I get from Linda Blair, the reason the demon goes after her, because it removes that whole anyone could have been affected by this. And the
Mm.
fact that it's a
Right?
child, right, is all the more terrifying because
Mhm.
they're not safe. You can't protect them. So when it's only or specifically people who have some sort of mark, essentially, or some sort of quote
Yeah.
unquote gift, it takes it into a
Mm.
very cheesy direction. You might as well have had aliens coming down and only abducting people who had, who were members of Mensa. Like
Mhm.
it becomes cliched. Um,
Mhm.
and I read one famous review from when it came out that had sort of the statement that their overall view is that the movie was very bad, though there were flashes of brilliance. And I will say that I could see that. There are several concepts in this film that were not borne out by the actual film, by the full plot. And there were actually some really cool effects. I actually really liked the sort of aerial flying scenes with the locust, where essentially,
Mhm.
the father's spirit or his psychic mind is being led with Pazuzu on the wings of this locust. That was neat. And Father Lamont is the name of Richard Burton's priest. So that's kind of cool. As much as it's very heavy-handed it feels inauthentic. The design of James Earl Jones' African get up, like it's very cliched. And I mean, it could be, we know that the cliche is born from some reality, right? But it's a stereotype that he's covered in gold bands and sits on the throne of in this case, a locust. He has a big locust helmet mask thing on. It turns out it's a vision, and actually his character is an adult, and the only thing he knows about being exercised is that his mother told him that was the case back in the day. But he's a scientist, and he's helping breed locusts that don't go crazy and go swarm crops. So that I think is a nice touch. Actually, it brought the supernatural back to a reality that was grounded enough that, like, oh, that's actually cool. You're seeing like a spiritual version of someone. But again, it's too disconnected from the rest of the movie to matter. Number one, I still don't know why that's part of the movie. I don't think it has anything to do with the actual final elements of the film at all.
Right.
And also,
I almost felt like it was sort of like because he like failed the test.
yeah,
It felt almost like, oh, we failed the test of faith, so now you get like this other version of reality.
that would be interesting. And see, they could have
Yeah.
done things like that.
I felt like they were grasping at that, or
Yeah.
like, or there was potential, but they were
Mhm.
actually doing something much clumsier that my brain was trying to fill in and be like, no, they're doing something
Yes.
cool. And it's like,
Yes.
really, they weren't. But like it felt almost like he was like, oh, you failed, so here's this other version of reality where he's just like a scientist, like
Yeah.
doing this somewhat parallel thing to what he would have done if he was a shaman.
That's a very interesting concept, and I like that. But as you said, it's us trying to find a rhyme or reason. This is a good time, I think, to talk about the script situation that occurred. So the original script was written by William Goodhart. William Goodhart was a playwright primarily. He did write several films. He wrote, he's credited with writing this film, but he wrote Cloud Dancer in 1980, and he wrote a play which he then turned into a screenplay called Generation from 1969. And it was a fairly well received sort of comedy about a father and his pregnant daughter. So anyway, so that was sort of um his claim. And I believe that the theater run, I could be mistaken on this, but I believe that what is his name? Was it Peter Fonda who I think starred in that play production. So I mean, it was a kind of a big deal. But he wrote the script, and according to Linda Blair signed on for the film because originally she had turned down the film because William Friedkin and William Peter Blatty had tried to come up with concepts for a sequel and decided they couldn't think of anything that would be appropriate. They said no, and they walked away from it and left it. But Warner Brothers wanted to do the sequel because money. So they kept trying to get Linda Blair, and she said no. They tried to get much of the rest of the cast from the first film. They said no. And finally Linda Blair said they came to me with a script and it was good. And I said, you know what? Okay, I'll sign on. But that was the original script by William Goodall and Goodhart. And then it was rewritten heavily and pieced together by director John Boorman and Rospo Pallenberg. Now, Rospo Pallenberg actually ended up directing a large portion of this film for John Boorman, even though he never directed a feature before, because Boorman fell ill. He had, I think it was a viral infection, a lung thing perhaps. But anyway, he was like, well, you can do it. You can do it. And to his credit, he had written, or after this, I guess, written a fair number of successful films with John Boorman. He'd done Deliverance before this. He was on The Script, Excalibur, etc. So he wasn't a nobody, but he was not familiar. I guess he was inexperienced. So that was one issue that people had problems with, I guess, in the cast and crew. But again, they wanted to finish the film. But because they rewrote it, William Goodhart did not want anything to do with it, and also he didn't really have a chance to do anything with it. And Linda Blair said that unfortunately she was then locked into the contract, and the script was trash. And which I believe, because of the final product, is such a mess thematically and narratively. Like, it's all over the place. I can't tell what was originally part of the plot and what was crammed in, shoehorned in. Scenes don't go anywhere. They have they bring up one concept and then it goes out the window. And it was a problem. So
Also, what kind of job did her mom have?
she's an actress, I think, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and they don't mention that. I mean, that is in this, that
It
is in the
seemed like
original.
it seemed like it, but like they only
Well,
barely. It
they
doesn't really make
they
sense. But her mom's always gone, and there's someone else that takes care of her.
they couldn't
And
get
you're just like,
the
what?
mother, and
Yeah,
she refused to do it. And she's very you know, famous actress. It's Chris McNeil. She played the mother, and they couldn't get her, so they got her maid, essentially. And who I think
yeah,
was Kitty Wynn. Yeah, Kitty Wynn was the maid. And but it doesn't make sense. It's very frustrating because you don't know why. They don't even say she's on a shoot. And so
yeah,
that's why, which is kind of, that would be perfect, right? I mean, that's what
yeah.
happens. And she was being taken care of. Instead, they give Sharon the sort of, just, she's just a worried nursemaid who doesn't seem to really
Yeah,
do anything. She
right.
wakes, you know, Regan up in the morning, and Regan is, there's just no, there's fucking tap scene in this, by the way. So according to Linda Blair, John Boorman said early on, Regan has to tap, and she said
Yeah.
Regan doesn't fucking tap. But she, for whatever reason, ended up learning tap for this, which she then said she actually enjoyed, to learn tap. But why is it in this movie?
Mhm.
I'll tell you the one reason why it's in this movie: because Linda Blair had developed a large chest, was sort of known for it, and so they put her in a braless, skimpy, like, sport top, and had her
Mhm.
bounce on tap for a random scene. Now, at this point in time in the plot, Regan is underage. I think she's like
Mhm.
17 or somewhere,
Yeah.
16, 17, something like that. In the you know, the chronology of the film. And if that's not kind of weird enough, um, it doesn't fit. It's just such
Mm.
a weird scene. Like, I don't know if John Boorman was like being kickbacked by some sort of tap initiative, because tap was very big in the late 80s. Like, I know every boy was like, oh, I'm taking tap. It was a
Yeah.
strange, strange thing. Um,
Mm.
to have in this movie. And I think, and I mean, she was only, I think she was 18 at the time of this film's release. So uh just a weird, it just gave a weird vibe. They also, in the script, which in a more, gritty, intense film, it would have made sense, but they wanted, um during Father Lamont's sort of fall in the climax, which literally takes place in a crumbling set piece of that original house, which they couldn't use. They couldn't use any of the original locations because The Exorcist had such a cursed concept and such a connotation with the devil and Satan, that nobody would allow them to use the original shooting set. So they had to rebuild the house. And you can tell it doesn't really look, it's fine, but it doesn't look like the house. You know, it's not the case. You know, it looks like it's there to be destroyed. And sure enough, it's destroyed. But in that final scene, Father Lamont sort of gives in to Pazuzu, and they wanted him to essentially rape Regan's character in the house where the original exorcism happened.
Mm.
I mean, I could see that. The whole point is it's evil. I can see that happening in a better script. But Linda Blair said, absolutely not going to happen.
Oh,
Not
yeah.
fucking doing it. Totally understand. Totally get it. I fully respect that. And had they had intimacy coordinators, I think they would have backed that up at the time. But he does sort of like get on top of her, but it's not her in this version of the script. This doesn't make any sense, but they go back to the original house, and I guess, spoiler alert, but nothing leads to anything else with any sort of understanding of the cause and effect. They go back to the original house because that's where it started. Don't know why. I would think it started in Africa,
Mhm.
but where Pazuzu was, right? Somewhere over there. But sure enough, it apparently is linked to her house, which Father Lamont brings them to. Sharon's there. Sharon bursts into flame for some god knows reason, and burns because apparently Pazuzu has the power to do that somehow, even though he
It's a wind spirit.
couldn't use the wind spirit. He couldn't do that before. It was there was no rhyme or
Mhm.
reason. Like, it was an interesting effect, no rhyme or reason. And then we have Father Lamont losing it and trying to mount the demon version of Linda Blair's character, which is actually a body double because she refused to get in the makeup again. The makeup's fine, but it's not as good as the original makeup. But she's Linda Blair goes upstairs, and there is herself on the bed in the demon form. And I thought the first time I'd watched this, and because it'd been so long ago, the second time I watched it for this podcast, that was in their brain somehow, right? Because why would there be a physical manifestation of the demon here? Because it's not a physical, it has to possess a body. That's kind of the concept, right,
Mhm.
of possession, and why it's so scary. But that's not the case. It's physically there,
Mhm.
and it's defeated by Father Lamont trying to ravage her, and then the floor collapsing, uh and the demon falling through the floor, because that makes sense. um
A wind
Science,
demon
religion, nothing,
falling.
right? Nothing could destroy the demon. But a minor fall from the second floor of a small bungalow
Mhm.
was it that
Mhm.
took the whole thing down.
Yep.
It was terrible. It was a terrible ending. It was not satisfying. Not only was it not satisfying, it was weirdly paced. It You have a movie that doesn't have a lot of action, and then you slam in this clumsy set piece. I think I just don't know what the original.
Did we even get like a moment where we're like, which one's the real
No,
girl?
they didn't even.
Like,
Like, it could have been, there could have been, you could have handled that so much better. Like, you could have done the old classic thing, like Pazuzu has now taken control of Father Lamont, is guiding his what he sees so much that he sees the demon as Regan and goes to
yeah.
consummate his relationship with the demon, but it's really the real life Regan, and she's struggling
Mhm.
against him. And that is, yes, it's been done before, but at least it makes sense, and it's somewhat intellectual. There's some sort of
Mhm.
purpose behind it. But we don't get that. We get nothing that's connected to anything. So even with the removal of the ridiculous sort of MacGuffin device of the brain, like, synthesizer thing, which
Mhm.
you can see in a much more, I think, well executed version in, say, Stranger Things, with 11 psychic powers having to go into sensory deprivation to reach out. It's been done a million times, but it's it's so clumsily handled and should never have been in here to begin with. And if it was, you could have just used hypnosis and not had the concept of people entering her dreams. Like, you could have had her
Mhm.
just like go into hypnosis and then describe it, and then the people listening become invested. Like, you could have had some sort of
Mhm.
supernatural element replace the so ridiculously unbelievable scientific bit. It's
Mm.
it's a clusterfuck of a film. It really is. And Linda Blair said she got along very well with Richard Burton. Richard Burton does, I think, a very poor job in this movie. He said afterward, he's like, it was a paycheck film. He was going through the
Mhm.
divorce with Elizabeth Taylor at the time. And Linda Blair said he was heavily drinking and would show up on set drunk quite a bit. Linda Blair herself at this time was in her heavy drug use period and was late to set every day. I believe in I think John Boorman's book on his films and experience in the industry, said that she once came and was proud because she was only 10 minutes late. She herself said it was 20 minutes late.
Mhm.
I, as someone who is chronically late, I can attest that is a feeling we sometimes get. But it reminded me, which we haven't talked about on this pod, but we absolutely will. Uh, it reminded me of the Super Mario Brothers movie, the original, I think
Mhm.
1993 one, where people on set were so unhappy with the directors, the husband wife director team, that they would be combative. I believe John Leguizamo and Bob Hoskins, who played Mario and Luigi, would get drunk in their trailer every day and go to set completely wasted.
Mhm.
And sometimes Bob Hoskins wouldn't come out, and so it just, that kind of insane troubled production, fiasco element. This was originally conceived by Warner Brothers as a throwaway rehash, a cheap by movie house movie production studio standards, a cheap film, and they wanted Friedkin and Blatty to just rehash the whole thing, and they said absolutely not, we're out. So then they're like, well, we'll do more, but they ended up getting a big cast, right? A good cast. So they're like, okay, we'll highbrow it then, but it's still going to be fairly cheap. Well, then after all this stuff had happened, people were under contract, all the deal, they were still trying to get locations and they couldn't get the locations. So that added like 5 million to the budget because they had to build the sets. And I assume only the set of the house. So I don't, whatever. And also they didn't give you the famous shot really convincingly of the original Exorcist, where your exorcist priest is standing at the base of the stairs and just in silhouette with fog and the green light. Like, it's so iconic. And why would you rebuild the house set if you can't perfectly execute that same shot? Just ridiculous. So anyway, John Boorman was not given a lot of credit for this movie, and I think it's well deserved. He said this was his, in my opinion, radical misunderstanding of why audience didn't like this movie. He said it's because he didn't embrace the gore and basically violence of the original feature, which is funny because those of us who watch The Exorcist, it is not gory. There is disturbing content. Linda Blair at one point violently masturbates with a crucifix. They're vomiting, really terrifying makeup and shot. Like, it's very scary. It's a very unnerving film, but there is not a great deal of gore. It's very much a heart attack or being knocked out a window. Like, so that's a huge misunderstanding of why it's a cop out. Basically, he tries to say, I wanted to make something positive and highbrow, but the audience just wanted violent exploitation, which is hot garbage, because he gave a film that, one, actually has more graphic scenes, Sharon burning to death in the open air and her skin melting off, right? I mean, that's much more graphic. So it's ridiculous. Most people who criticize other people's films, especially sequels to their own films, are, I would say they tend to be not extremely nasty about it. William Friedkin did not approach this in this way. He actually said in an interview that I gotta find the actual quote, what is said to be his quote here. There's quite a few ridiculous things. So William Friedkin watched a half hour of an early cut, apparently because he was working at Technicolor, where they were cutting, what would you call it? Exposing and producing the print for the film. And he's like, it's terrible. He compared it to seeing a traffic accident. And then he says, it was horrible. It's just a stupid mess made by a dumb guy. Sir John Boorman by name, somebody who should be nameless, but in this case should be named. Scurrilous, a horrible picture. That's pretty bold. It's sort of like if Martin Scorsese came out and let's pick someone, said James Gunn said, or David Goyer said, they're an idiot. They're terrible at making films. They shouldn't be famous. And I have no problem mentioning their name because they just have no business making a movie. Plenty of people may think other filmmakers, that's true of them, but I don't know too many who actually would say that. And that was contemporary to the film's release. So anyway, it was pretty terrible. It was horribly received. John Boorman was recutting prints while it was in theaters, a la Cats, because it was so terrible. Apparently the original cut's runtime was about 3 hours, and they cut it down for distribution. I'm curious to see the 3 hours because I have a feeling we might at least get a couple more snippets of the original concepts in this movie. But
maybe they'll explain the fire in the basement.
Yeah, there is a second cut that's been released. Yeah, the fire in the basement. It's just, she's psychic too.
Oh, there's a fire in the, like, there's a fire somewhere. Let's go check the basement. There's like a random box of toys that's like on fire. How did that even happen? It doesn't
And
make
like,
any
yeah,
sense.
and Linda Blair drew a picture of a house of like a fire, and that's how, when she
Yeah.
was in a dream meditative state
Yeah.
because of the machine. And yeah, it doesn't make sense.
No.
um it's almost, I wonder sometimes if they were trying to do like a meta concept of, because as I said, some of the stories circulating around the Exorcist original release is that Prince in various places caught fire, sort
Mm.
of increasing its legend. And
Mm-hmm.
that was, maybe that was a concept, but it's just, so many things are not explained. So many things just happen because I do think if this film, because especially if someone said phantasmagoric imagery, which I think is appropriate. There's a few moments of that, like the locusts, etc. The fast, any scene with James Earl Jones, as you said, there's sort of a failed
Yeah.
test feeling where um, uh, past Priest Lamont is supposed to approach James Earl Jones' sort of mystic version of himself with
Mm-hmm.
faith, and instead he falls into a pit of water and spikes, indicating, I guess, that his faith has been broken and he's entered some sort of
Mm-hmm.
pact bargain with this demon. And there's moments that are actually quite visually good. I think that that's true. I don't think that it's fair to say John Boorman can't direct a shot. It is probably not true. I mean, he has made several successful films, several films that many of us have enjoyed. I mean, I think Deliverance is actually a decent film, but this is why directors do not always make a movie better when they think they're writers. They don't. Some do, some don't. I had this, if you've gone to film school, or in my case, fiction writing school at a film school, and so you've ended up working with numerous directors, it is, I remember this, I unfortunately forget his name, but a playwright, I probably quoted it on this pod before. He said, somebody asked him at a conference, what is it like to see someone bring your script to life on the main stage? And he said, it's like being flayed alive every night.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's so not the original vision, right? The
Mm-hmm.
nature of filmmaking is somewhat collaborative. Unless you're writing and directing, and even then, you're not always running the camera, right? You
Mm-hmm.
trust your cinematographer to do certain things, right? You trust your
Mm-hmm.
cast, you trust lighting, you trust all these things. You can only control so much as one person. And
Mm-hmm.
I can only imagine that this movie has that to an extreme degree. Everybody who is in it says they're disappointed in it. There were some defenders, two defenders of it. I don't think either of them said it's a fantastic film. I think that would be ridiculous. But they said there were merits of it, were Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino. This doesn't surprise me. I think they're both incredible
Mm-hmm.
filmmakers. I think Martin Scorsese is probably one of the greatest American filmmakers ever. I'm pretty sure. I don't even think that that's really arguable at this point. But just because there are elements that are quite interesting does not a good film make. It's a bad movie. The people that tended to defend from a critical standpoint this film were ones that were radically against the original film. It
Mm-hmm.
was like Pauline Kael, who is a well-known but often uh, oppositional film critic, often defended films that other critics were like, this is god awful. he she loved it. She said she loved this film. She said that it was too cadenced and exotic and too deliriously complicated to succeed with most audiences, i.e., you're too stupid to enjoy this film if you don't like it, which is such a funny way. It's such a ridiculously defensive way to promote the virtues of a movie, right? It's like saying, of course I lost the election. You're all idiots. It may be true in some cases, but saying it is certainly not going to win you any arguments. Um, she said also she called it Winged Camp, a horror fairy tale gone wild, a king-size folly with enough visual magic for a dozen good movies. I would actually say that that's not off the mark. We've talked about the fact that it's such a mishmash of scenes and concepts that it's um, incoherent. I do think you could have pulled several of those elements and any one of them could have been turned into a movie. I have long said that it would like the new Exorcist Believer movie, which I think was abysmal. I was so disappointed. It actually starts fairly strong with a good setup, and I liked the recent Halloween trilogy. I think that some of the risks they took at least were interesting. And as a big Halloween fan who adores the original two films, it just and 4 and 5, excuse me, 1, 2, and 4, 5, terrible. Anyway, to have the Exorcist Believer commit so many of the same sins this movie did, moving away from Catholicism and the Catholic imagery, having things happen for no reason. The demons have power over physical things that they never would have had in the original Exorcist because it's beyond the pale. It makes it, who cares? Like, if you can't figure out the laws of the world, why do I care? Right? Nothing feels real. The twist is not a twist. It's a bad movie. They drop the ball on every level. And this movie is much better because of it. I will say that. I actually dislike this film a great deal less because I saw what those same mistakes it makes could have been. They could have been so much worse. So that's a complicated way of saying I think this movie would have been an interesting cult film that I could have actually gotten behind as at least a fascinating mess had it not been attached to The Exorcist. If you had it completely unrelated, there's a girl, she finds out later that she had been possessed as a child, and these strange dreams are what triggers her to seek therapy. You could have had an interesting story, albeit it could have been a decent Exorcist ripoff, of which there are many, right? Especially at the
Interesting, yeah.
time. But because it's tied to the greatest, in my opinion, and many others, the greatest Catholic horror film, the greatest possession and exorcism film of all time, and a direct follow-up to it, it was just a nightmare. It's like if they followed up Barbie with a hypersexualized action film starring Barbie, right? Just, it would be terrible. People would absolutely, riot against it, as it broke all of the tenets that made the original valuable and fascinating and unique. So, Mandy, this is like yet again one of my diatribes on this. Would you recommend The Exorcist II: The Heretic to anyone? If so, why, and to who? And if not, why?
Oh man. I I don't even really have anything quippy for this. Like it's just like no, it's just a mess. It's confusing. It's I mean, there's some good production value and interesting stuff, like you said, with the imagery, but in general, it's like so disjointed
Yeah.
that it doesn't make it that even as background type stuff to have on. Like it's a skip. Like just skip it. Just
Yeah,
watch the third one, right? That makes this
yeah,
one not happen. It erases all
absolutely.
sins.
Absolutely. And the third one, and read the books. The first
Yeah.
Exorcist novel is quite excellent, and it very much is akin to the movie. I mean, both first and third, William Peter Blatty adapted his own novels to the screenplays, I think quite successfully.
Mhm.
Especially watch the Legion, the preferred cut of the director's cut of Exorcist 3, although I think they're both quite good, but the original
Mm.
is much better thematically and narratively.
Yeah.
But I guess I would recommend this film to super fans of The Exorcist only after they've watched all of the other films, excluding Exorcist Believers. You can watch it, but it's just going to make you mad. But if you watch this film, I mean, the original Exorcist, jump right to 3, and then you can get that 2000s flair, like you were talking about, in a decent
Mhm.
way with Exorcist the Beginning. And then you can watch what I think is a higher brow film, a Dominion prequel to The Exorcist. Interesting factoid, because I don't know when we'll return to the world of The Exorcist here, about Exorcist the Beginning, which was released in theaters, and Dominion, which was released direct to video, is
Mhm.
Dominion was being made first, and the
Mhm.
studio was scared about what was coming out. And so they hired, without telling that director, they didn't cancel the film, it was already in production. They hired another filmmaker to make the more, probably, yes, it's a more mainstream version, called The Exorcist Beginnings. And I don't think Exorcist Beginning is bad. I actually enjoy that film. I do think Dominion is smarter. It's more fascinating, but it's also, again, falls victim to what The Exorcist 3 did, which is it doesn't have enough explosive, monster kind of vibe. So I know why they did that. But the director of Dominion was quite heartbroken and enraged when he found out that not only
Mm.
did they not trust the film, but they were not going to release it in theaters after they told him that. So Exorcist is a crazy, crazy franchise with all sorts of trouble stories. I'm very curious to hear what comes out about Exorcist believers, because I have a feeling there is quite a troubled background of that, although it could just be a bad movie. There's just time will tell. But otherwise, skip The Exorcist 2. Unless there's a fan cut that removes Regan and all references to the original film, of which there's really not that many other than Regan's presence and the name Pazuzu. You could take those out and make a film, and it would be like an interesting little B movie.
Mm.
But yeah, it's a bad movie. It deserves to be reviled as sort of an almost franchise killer. I mean, it did kill the franchise for 20, for what, 15, 13 years at least.
Mm.
But does it exist as one of the worst films of all time? I do think that's putting it a little far. I think it's drawn some of the most ire of sequels of all time, and deservedly so. It's not a good movie. Are there a couple of things to enjoy? Sure. Is it the worst film ever? Of course not. That doesn't make it good. So if that in any way sounds good to you, feel free to watch this movie. I don't think it probably does. Thank you so much for listening to Cult and Classic Films podcast. I hope you enjoyed this and all the extra stuff. If you do watch The Exorcist II, enjoy the scene where Father Lamont goes to the mountainside monastery it's in somewhere in Africa. I apologize for not remembering where they're supposed to have put this, but enjoy the cast of Black people that they got to dance in. I can only imagine they said, dance like natives, which is right away offensive. I'm putting the words into their mouth, but I'm pretty sure that was it. But what's wonderful is that they dance as though they are at a 70s club. So it looks like sort of the costuming from the Moroccan characters in Casablanca, doing like, I don't know, step shuffle disco. Like it's goofball. So enjoy that. That's a fun moment. Thank you all so much. Please go to cultandclassicfilms.com, sign up for a newsletter, and buy our films. We release films from ultra low budget filmmakers, many of which we've talked about on this podcast, in collectors and regular Blu-ray editions. They're exclusive to us in those forms, and they are super inexpensive. And what's best is they not only do they help us continue, but money goes directly to the filmmakers for every copy we sell. So we are not simply taking money, saying we'll get your movie out there like a lot of distributors do. I'm not going to name names at this moment, but it's a nice thing to do, and you'll enjoy the movies. They're super fun. They're super bonkers. They're super things you will not find anywhere else. So go to cultandclassicfilms.com and do that, or patreon.com/cultandclassicfilms, where you can find that and all sorts of things. You can also get exclusive pre-shows and sometimes post-show content from our recordings, which is a lot of fun. Sometimes the funniest things happen there. I know you're like, well, why didn't you put it in the pod? Well, can't do everything, but you get that as a member, even if you only subscribe for $5. Thank you so much. Please listen next week when we talk part 2 of Priest in Peril, 2018's banana sandwich film, Velocipaster. And to play us out, as always, is the Chud with All About Evil. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Cult and Classic Podcast. This podcast is important to me, but what's more important are the rights, privileges, and freedom from violence of everyone in this country and in this world. And that means supporting Black Lives Matter. If you'd like to make a donation, please go ahead and visit cultandclassicpodcast.com, where we have a list of places you can donate and help out. And please stay safe.